Hello and welcome back. In this week's video we're going to look at 5 simple techniques that will improve almost every photograph. Some of these I've demonstrated before, but I thought it was a good idea to put these together in a simple package so that you can see how these different techniques work. So let's get started.
The first thing we're going to have a look at is what we call the inverse overlay method of remapping the tonal range. Sounds a little bit complicated, but the effect is amazing, and it works particularly well on a lot of images where there's some dark and shade and you want to really bring out the darker areas. And it doesn't work on every image, but it works so well on some of them. So let's step through the process, because there are a few steps in this and we'll cover them step by step and explain why we do things. The first thing we do, here's our background image. This is a raw file opened from Lightroom with some processing applied, and you can see that parts of it are quite dark, and yet there are also a lot of highlight areas. We don't want to destroy those highlights, but we would like to remap those dark areas and lift them up. So the first thing we will do is duplicate the background. Now you can do it a number of different ways. You can do Control J on your keyboard, create a new duplicate layer, or if you've already got some various other processing steps applied to an image, such as various layers, the shortcut method is Control Alt Shift and E. Does the same thing. You end up with a composite layer, or simply you can just drag the base layer down onto the plus icon at the bottom of the layers palette and you end up with a duplicate layer. That's if you're working on just the base image without any other layers. So here we are back in the base image, and we'll do it on this image, and then we'll apply it to a number of other images that already have processing applied. So the first thing I'm going to do in this case is duplicate the background layer. There is no other processing, so the easiest way is just drag that down and make a duplicate of the background image. Now the next thing we do is we go and make some adjustments to this image layer, and this is not what we would normally do in Photoshop with any image adjustments, but we go up to the image menu, we go to the adjustments tab, and we come down to desaturate, and you could use the shortcut Shift Control U on a Windows machine, and what it's going to do is take away all of the color information from the image. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go back into that image menu and the adjustments panel, and we're going to come down to invert the image. So what we've created now is a black and white negative of the base image. Doesn't look like anything so far, but there's another couple of steps. The next thing we do with this image is we go up to the filters menu and we go to the blur section, Gaussian blur, and in the blur panel what we're going to do is we're going to blur it by an amount of approximately 250. It will vary a little bit depending on the resolution of your camera and the size of the image, but 250 is a good starting point. So what we've done now is we've inverted the image and now we've blurred it. So all we have now is a range of light and dark tones on a background. So how do we apply this to the image? Well, what we do now is we use the power of blending modes to apply this to the image, and what we will do is come down to the layer that we've created, click on the blending modes panel, and we go to overlay. Now in a lot of instances when you apply this technique, the result is way too strong, and in this case let's turn it off and on. That's our original image, that's our new image, and you'll see that the brighter tones have not been blown out at all, but we've dramatically raised the levels on all of the darker tones in the image, but it's usually going to be a little bit too much. So what you can do then is simply go to your opacity slider and then adjust the power of this effect to suit the image. Or if you would prefer, let's just say let's leave that back at 100% opacity. If we were to apply a layer mask to this image, then we can apply this selectively to the parts that we want. So to apply a new layer mask, and let's say we want it applied to none of the image to start with, what you would do is hold down the Alt key at the same time as you press the layer mask icon, so that provides a layer mask filled with black so that there's none of this effect visible. and then we would just apply that to our image by taking our brush tool, and here you could use quite a large brush, but make sure it's a soft edged brush. Let's just click on that, make sure it's a soft edged brush, and you can make it as large as you want. And I would keep the opacity down a fair bit so that we can build this effect up. And so with the brush selected, the opacity chosen, make sure you have white as your foreground color here. And if you have anything else than black and white here, you'd need to reset it by clicking on the little black and white square above. And you can then swap those colors over by using this double-ended arrow, or there's a shortcut on the keyboard which is the X key. What we want to do is paint on with white on a black mask, and we will start to reveal the image, and we can then selectively apply this extra lighting wherever we want it. And it's a really effective way of building up the luminance in an image. And again, it doesn't matter if I paint onto the water, because in this blurred overlay, and let's just click on the on this part of the layer, take it back to normal, and disable that mask so we see the overlay. The parts of the waterfall are in fact darker, so that there's going to be no effect of us painting that in. And we'll go back to overlay blend mode. Whoops, helps if I don't paint on the actual tool, so that's a trick to watch out for. I'll just undo that brush tool. When you go back to paint on the mask, make sure you've clicked on the mask first and it has the square around it before you start painting the light in. So the inverse overlay tool works really well in remapping the tonal range without affecting the color in an image. So let's have a look at this. How would it work on other images? Now this is an image that has been processed to a monochrome effect, and I've deliberately made this one quite dark because I wanted to reflect the contemplation of the chimp sitting here lost in thought. But let's say we wanted to remap the tones in this a little bit and just brighten parts of it up. So because there's a whole lot of processing steps here in this group, I'm going to use the shortcut Control Alt Shift and E to make a new composite layer, and then we would go through these steps. And what do? Image adjustments. Now obviously in this case we don't need to desaturate, but let's do it anyway. And we've desaturated that image because it's already monochrome. Image adjustments, invert. So we now have a negative version. I'll get rid of that paintbrush tool for the moment. And then we would go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and apply around our 250 amount. You'll see here in this one that it's just about taken away all of the luminosity in the image. So you might want to bring that back a little bit so that you've got more areas where there's going to be a remapping of the tones, and you can do this by eye looking at the image. Let's say we're okay with that. It's now been applied. We'll change our blend mode to overlay, and we've dramatically changed the lighting. Obviously in this image you wouldn't want to be doing that as much, but you can just change the opacity to suit. And what about a couple of other images? Similar image here. I've already done the inverse overlay. Let's have a look at the difference. You'll see here that the difference can be fairly subtle. I've brought the opacity back to 35, and it's just really lightened some of the darker areas and just kept the bright areas from blowing out. And again, by using the opacity slider, you can adjust the power of the effect, or you can paint onto a mask. And let's have a look at one other example. This again was a very dark image similar to the chimp. Let's just do the Control Alt Shift E. This is in fact a color image even though it looks monochrome, so let's just go back, image adjustments, desaturate, image adjustments, invert, filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and in this case, yeah, that looks about right for that image. And I will now change that to overlay, and we've totally remapped the tones. Again, in this instance, it's way too powerful, but we'll just bring that right back until we get the sort of effect we're looking for, just a subtle remapping of the tones. So that's technique number 1. Now our second technique also uses a blur overlay, but it uses it in a much different way. So let's get rid of our old friend the gibbon, and let's move on to using a way to intensify the colours in a subtle way. Now it's normally used on portraits to really give the skin a nice glow, but here on this image of a lot of kelp, we can use the same technique to just boost the colour and give it a real bit of a glow. So we do a similar thing. This image has had a lot of processing steps applied to it, so we're going to use the technique Control Alt Shift and E to make a new composite layer. And with that composite layer created, we go straight to the filters menu, blur and Gaussian blur. This time we're only going to blur it by a relatively small amount, just an amount that starts to give you a little bit of softness on the image, and it could be as little as 6 or 7, but somewhere around 10 or more will give you the right effect. So we're doing the same thing. We're blurring the image, click OK, and now we'll give it the overlay treatment. Now obviously at 100% this is ridiculous. Let's go all the way back down to around about 20%, and you'll see that it gives a subtle increase in saturation and vibrancy to the colours without giving this the oversaturated feel that you sometimes get with just using a straight hue saturation adjustment. So let's just try a straight hue saturation adjustment and bring that up. You'll see that pretty quickly it gets really overblown and you lose any subtlety, but somewhere around there is probably similar. But let's go back to our blur overlay technique. It also intensifies the contrast slightly. So this is another way you can treat an image and bring out the color intensity. Let's try this on a portrait, and let's have a look at this one. This rather cheesy portrait, again, has had a lot of processing applied to it. So let's do Control Alt Shift and E to make a new composite layer. Go straight to the blur menu, Gaussian blur. Yes, maybe about 10 might be good. Let's click OK. Just enough to blur some of the color and the details. Again, go back to our overlay blend mode, and that's ridiculous. Looks like Donald Trump. That's really a bad compliment. But again, bringing it back to a very low opacity, and it just gives the skin a lovely warm glow and just adds a little bit of intensity. And we can try that on another image where we've already applied the same technique, and just giving that very low opacity and a very small blur amount increases the contrast slightly and gives the skin and those sort of colors a lovely warmth that it's very hard to replicate any other way. And we can apply it also to this image that is by Christopher Campbell, free from the internet. Let's just do that, and this is a base image, so let's just duplicate it, filter, Gaussian blur, about 10 is what I applied, and go to our overlay blend mode, and you'll see that in some instances you're going to get a bit of a nasty effect where that deep shadows can come out looking like bruises. So you have to be a little bit careful with it. So in that instance we would apply a layer mask to that layer and then paint that part out with our brush tool so that we don't exaggerate that effect any more than we need to. This already has a strong color cast from the girl's hair, and we don't want to enhance that, but it does give a lovely glow to the skin. So that's technique number 2. Now technique number 3 is a form of selective sharpening to add depth into an image. So let's get rid of our portraits and let's have a look at an image that we looked at slightly earlier, and that is a landscape image. And what we want to do is we want to enhance the feeling of depth in an image, and one way we can do that is to make the foreground areas look sharper so that the sharpness gives that feeling of closeness to the viewer. And again, this image has had a lot of processing applied to it, so let's use the technique Control Alt Shift and E to make a new composite layer. And in this technique we're going to use a form of high pass sharpening. So we go to Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask, and this is where we bring up the Unsharp Mask menu, and this is often called a 25-25-0 or 25-25-1 technique, where we use an amount of 25 in our sharpening, which is actually a very low amount, but we use it over a very large radius of 25 pixels. Normally, if you're applying unsharp masking to an image, you would be looking at 1 pixel or less. But in this instance, we want 25, 25, and the threshold amount determines how much difference in tone before we start to apply that sharpening technique. Now, you probably want at least 1 rather than 0 to ensure that you're not trying to sharpen areas that have got the same tonal value. So let's apply that, and the sharpening technique will appear, and at the moment it's applied over the whole image. We don't want that. So what we will do now is we'll apply a mask, and again using the Alt key and clicking on the Add Mask tool, we add a layer mask filled with black, so the effect has no appearance on the image. But let's just zoom in on the foreground, and you'll see that the foreground's a little bit blurry, but by using our brush tool and selecting white by clicking on X, and in this instance we can go straight to 100% opacity. We don't need to worry about being subtle here, and what we're going to do is we're going to paint in a little bit of extra sharpness in that foreground. Now I'll probably need to just zoom back a little bit to see the image, and we're going to paint that extra sharpness into the foreground, and where you paint it onto really is up to you, but you really want to just apply it to the areas closest to the viewer so that we enhance that feeling of sharpness. Let's just zoom to fit the screen. It may be a little too subtle to see at fit the screen, but you'll see if we zoom in a little bit more that there's a little bit of a subtle increase, not only in apparent sharpness but in contrast, and so that fools the brain into thinking that this is closer to the viewer. Let's have a look at another example, and in this instance of some rocks on the south coast of Iceland, the foreground had some particularly interesting details, and again we wanted to enhance that feeling of depth. So again, Control Alt Shift E to make our composite layer. We go to Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask, 25, 25 and 1. These are sticky sliders, so once you've selected an amount, next time you go into that filter it's going to bring up the previous amount used. Let's go OK, and let's just zoom in a little bit tighter on this interesting rock formation or a volcanic intrusion in this part of the image, and you can see if I turn that off and then back on again, there's a subtle increase in not only apparent sharpness but in contrast that gives you an enhanced feeling of depth. But we don't really want it in the background because the background's a little bit soft anyway. We don't want to be doing that, so what do? We hold down the Alt key, add a layer mask, and then paint away with our brush and paint in the areas that we want to bring back in to reveal that apparent sharpness. And you can be fairly brutal with this. Paint over the areas where you want it to come in, and if you get to a point where you've got a bit of a noticeable edge, you can always just blur this mask a little more. And you'll see here that I've been very rough in painting this in. I've missed a few areas, and by clicking on Alt and clicking on the mask, it will load the mask over the image so you can see where you've really been a bit sloppy. But you don't really need to be any more precise than that. Let's go back to the mask, hold down Alt, click again to remove it, and let's have a look at the effect. A small and subtle effect, but it is entirely noticeable when you print the image. Let's just fit the screen again with that, so that we haven't lost anything, so that we've enhanced the apparent sharpness on all of this foreground area without affecting the background. So that is our simple technique number 3. Now moving on to technique number 4, we're looking at another way that we can paint in light and shadows into an image. So let's get rid of our rocks and move on to another image. Now here's an image of a mother rhino and calf having a sleep, but the lighting was pretty flat and I wanted to add a little bit more definition into the image. Now a lot of people propose the system of using a new layer filled with 50% grey and then painting on it with white or black, but I find that that doesn't give me enough control, and that if you make a mistake or you want to change it, it's a little bit harder to fix. So I use a technique where I apply 2 curves adjustment layers and then we paint them in using layer masks, and this gives you infinite control and you can vary the amount of shadow or light that you paint in. So let's have a look at how we do that. The first thing we do is we create 2 curves adjustment layers. So let's just click on the new curves adjustment layer number 1 and create a second one. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this first one and call it darken, because we want to know which one we're working on, and the second one, it's going to be called lighten, and we use either one of these to apply the effect. Now the first thing I'm going to do on both of these is invert the mask so that there's no effect apparent, and on the darken curves adjustment, basically what we're going to do is just pull down the white point slightly, pull down the darkness, and of course we can come back and readjust this at any time, so it doesn't really matter what we do, but initially this will give us a starting off point. And then on the lighten one, guess what we do? We just push up the curve in the middle to lighten everything. Now of course we're seeing no effect whatsoever because both of these layers have a black mask applied to them, and so there's no effect on the image. So let's come back down to our darken adjustment, and what I want to do now is I want to enhance the shadow areas on this image and give a little bit of 3-dimensionality to the shape, particularly on the mother. So we go back to our trusty brush tool, and that's a little bit large, so let's just use the square brackets keys, left hand square bracket key to make it smaller, right hand square bracket key to make it larger, and we don't need to be painting on with 100% opacity. Let's just bring that back down to about 50, and let's just look at the darker areas, and let's just paint in to enhance some of those shadow areas. And I think that there could be a little bit more shadow applied to this little area on the mother. Now even that looks like a little bit too much, so I'm going to go back and edit, undo that last brush tool, and I'm going to drop that opacity right back down to about 25%. We need to be a little bit more subtle, and of course we can amend this at any time, and you can see that you can really bring in more shadow detail wherever you think it's appropriate. And if you find that you've painted in some shadows that you don't really want, it's a simple matter of hitting the X key and then painting them back out again. So let's have a look at how I painted in some shadow here, and you'll see that it's very subtle. Let's just up that a little bit more. Say I've painted in some area here that I don't want, just hit the X key, paint it back out. And so it's infinitely adjustable, and nothing is locked in. Go back to our X key. I'll paint this on a little stronger than I would normally do, just for the effect that we're not sitting here forever looking at me painting with a brush tool. But you can see that you can add in some lines of shadow, emphasize what's already there, and also with our little cub, or not a cub, a calf here, we can start to add a little bit of shadow detail. And all of this is adding to the 3-dimensionality because our mind sees light and shade as shape, and we can bring that in, and we can add some subtle shadows into the image. You'll see here that when you look at the individual bits that I've painted in, it doesn't look that much, but when I turn them off, all of a sudden it makes a big difference. So having painted in some shadows, let's go now and paint in some lightning in the highlight areas where the sun ought to be falling on our wonderful creatures, and so we can add a little bit more light. on the highlight areas, and even if we wanted to, we could fill a little bit of light in where areas are too dark. And so again, let's just push this up a little bit higher so that we're not painting here forever, but we can add quite a lot of light and shade fairly quickly into an image, and it's really just a matter of how long you would like to spend bringing out these details. And when you just look at the image like that, it doesn't look as though you've done too much, but if I was to turn both of those layers off, it all of a sudden makes quite a big difference. And so the more subtle you are with painting these in, and I can say I've added a little bit of shadow there, it looks a little bit too much, well, I can just hit the X key, and instead of painting at 71%, I can paint it out at 21% and just remove a little bit of that piece by piece. So if we were to come down to our layer mask, hold down the Alt key and click the overlay, you can see here where it's all just simple brush strokes, and the same with the lightning brush strokes. They're just applied fairly simply, and this is a really beautiful way that you can build up contrast and light and shade on any image with a fairly subtle way of doing it. So let's have another look at another image here, and this is an image I created from absolutely nothing. It's meant to be some sort of primitive sea creature from below the sea, and it was made up of some textures and some shapes that I'd worked out from some other sources, and I put it on a dark background to simulate life below the sea, but of course it's lacking in any light and shade. So I've already prepared these layers, so let's just have a look. The first thing I did was darken overall, but keep some of the highlight areas. So let's just hold down the Alt key, look at that mask. So basically everything was darkened except these few areas that I painted out. So I've already just darkened, but I've kept these highlight areas. It's looking a little bit better, but I want it a little bit more realistic, so I've painted in some more shadow, and assuming the light source is coming from above, I've painted in shadows down around these areas. So let's just have a look at that. Here's my mask. So I've painted in shadows in a number of ways. So let's just go back to how we did that and just paint in more shadow detail. And particularly with things like this, I wanted that to look as though it was curved, so I have shadow on the bottom and I'd have lightning on the top. And by simply building up with lightning and darkening with a couple of layers that are infinitely repeatable, and if you really wanted to change the effect of how much darkening we applied, well, we can just change the curve or change the opacity. So we've got a lot more control using this technique than the simple painting on with a 50% grey area. I think it just takes a lot more work, and if you make a mistake or you don't like it, it's a bit hard to get rid of it. So using the method of a couple of curves adjustments, one to lighten, one to darken, you have so much more control and can create a three-dimensional apparent creature out of almost nothing. And the same goes for our old friend the chimp here, using two curves adjustments. Let's just have a look at the curve. Fairly simple curve, black mask, and then I've just painted in to just emphasize a little bit more of that shadow detail, again to just emphasize the three-dimensional shape, and also to just lighten in a couple of areas where the light would be falling on his shoulders and some of the fur. And this just creates a little bit more three-dimensionality. So that's our technique number 4. Now our fifth and final simple technique is how to apply a simple vignette to any image. We'll get rid of our old friend the chimp and let's have a look at a couple of images. Now typically on most landscape or other images, in fact it can be any image, if you wanted to add a vignette, how do you do it? There's various ways to do it, but this is the simple method I use. I go to my lasso tool and I just draw a very rough line around the areas where I want the vignette to occur, and it doesn't have to be regular, although it could be if you so decided. So I've drawn a rough vignette around the area I want. The next thing I do is I go up to the Select menu, Modify and Feather, and I feather that selection by the maximum amount, which is 360 pixels. You won't really see a difference here, but you'll see that some of the rough edges are disappeared. And what I want to do is, at the moment we have a selection of the center part of the image with a feathering at the edge, and what we want is we want the inverse of that. So we go back to the Select menu, choose Inverse. So now we have the marching ants around the border, and we have a fade of 360 pixels from the full effect at the border to this line here, or approximately this line here. And with that selection made, simply make a curves adjustment, pull the white point down slightly, pull the middle of the curve down a little bit, and you've got your vignette. And here's the mask that we've created, and this is the effect. And the idea of the vignette is that it should be fairly subtle. If it's a little bit too obvious, again, the simple method is just change the opacity and you've got a fairly subtle vignette. Now, another way to do this, and I'll just leave those there in the background, if you wanted a bit more of a regular shape, you could use the rectangular marquee tool and just come in and draw a marquee, something like that. Do the same thing, select, modify, feather, 360, select inverse, and then again with a curves layer. Effect a fairly subtle but regular transition, and here's the effect. Now, of course, in different images you're going to want a different shape vignette, so the best method I think is to use the marquee tool. And in this image, for instance, I wanted a simulation of an evening scene because Tasmanian devils only come out at night. They're a nocturnal animal, and so I wanted a fairly strong vignette to create that effect. So my center of interest, of course, is the animal itself, and so using my lasso tool, I've drawn a fairly tight curve around there. It doesn't have to be perfect. Select, modify, feather, 360. And of course, if your image is a fairly low resolution image, you don't need 360. It'll probably be too much, but you can vary that accordingly. Select inverse, add our curves adjustment, and then adjust to suit. And of course, the beauty of this is if you really wanted to modify the area that the vignette occurs on, you can just simply paint onto this mask with white or black. You can adjust the strength of the curve, or you can adjust the opacity to give you absolute control over the impact of the effect. And one reason why we use curves rather than, for instance, the levels or lightness, brightness and contrast, is that all of those tools, levels and brightness, contrast, are just really dumbed down versions of curves, and you don't have the subtle transition between the effect that you can obtain with even just a simple curve. Just for instance, if I was to reset that, if you're using levels, for instance, the only controls you've got is that and that. That's all you get in a levels adjustment, and the same thing with brightness and contrast. So you're much better off being able to use curves where you can, once you get used to working with this interface, you get a much better way of controlling things. So that's our fifth and final quick tip. I hope these have all been useful. In the next video, we're going to be tackling something a little more complicated, so come back and have a look then. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.